Hello and welcome. This is Wynyard Woodland Park. We're going to be doing a wild food walk for you today. Bit of history about the actual station itself. So this is Thorpefuel's station house on what used to be the Castle Eden railway line. That's why this place used to be known as Castle Eden Walkway. And then in the early 2000s the council bought a whole load of land off the Wynyard estates and they changed the name to Wynyard Woodland Park. So, history of the station house, the line was opened in the 1880s. It ran passenger and freight services up until the mid-1930s when the passenger service finished. Rumours have it that the only reason the passenger service was kept in operation and this station was kept open was because the King at the time, George V, was good friends with Lord Londonderry, who owned the Wynyard estate, and this was where he used to get off the train. So they kept it open purely for that. And then freight services ended in the late 1950s. The track came up at that point. The council bought the building and quite a lot of the surrounding land in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s it opened as Castle Eden Walkway, and then it was renamed in the early 2000s to Wynyard Woodland Park. So the station house, as you see today, the only original piece is the two-storey piece. Everything else is an addition. Well, it's a recreation. It used to be there, it was demolished in the 1960s and then it was rebuilt in the mid-1980s. And it's got a tea room in it at the moment. So the old Castle Eden line that used to run along here is now in the main part being turned into a cycleway. You can see cycleway number 1, and it gives you an idea of how far away we are from places. So we've got Stockton 6 miles that way, Sunderland's about 20 miles that way, but you can hit Peterlee before then. From here you go all the way north until you get to the A689 Hartlepool-Sedgefield Road. There's actually another car park at the other end that you can use as well if you want to kind of do the other end, so to speak, of the actual walkway. That's about 2 miles away from here. So this is Arboretum Fields at Wynyard Woodland Park. The field that surrounds the main play area, around the edge of it are trees that have been planted in order that they came back to the UK after the last ice age. So one of the first main trees that came back was this tree here. This is Juniper. So Juniper nowadays is only found in really upland areas, quite cool areas. It's a conifer, so it produces cones. But they're not cones like you would think of as like a pine cone. It's small and usually purple. It's like almost like a berry, really. That is taken off the tree and dried and used as an aromatic in various different things. But the main thing it's used for is the flavouring of gin. So the berries of this is taken and added to the hot liquid that will become gin to flavour the gin. So the next tree that came back after the last ice age were the birches. There's two different sorts, there's silver birch and there's downy birch. Downy birch has a slightly browner bark and it's found in damper areas. Silver birch, for obvious reasons, has silver bark or white bark and it's found quite commonly everywhere. It's known as a pioneer species. It's one of the first species of tree to come back to an area that's been opened up from either woodland or grassland that's been let to grow. So birch has several uses, both edible and otherwise. So we'll start with the edibles. So in the spring, before the actual leaves come out, when the sap starts rising, you can actually drill a hole into the trunk and the hole will leak water, well, a liquid that is slightly sugary. And it's perfectly good to drink straight from the tree because it's been filtered by the roots. It's got very few microbes and bacteria in it. You can take that liquid and you can boil it down into something that's got the consistency of maple syrup. You can then boil it down even further and it becomes like an axle greasy sort of consistency, and that's what it was used for during the Second World War by the Russians because it freezes at a lower temperature than petroleum-based axle greases. And then you can take it down even further and it forms a thing called a thermoplastic, and that is something that is hard when it's cold and soft when it's warm. So that was used for the setting of arrowheads onto arrow shafts. And obviously if you break an arrowhead, you just hold it over the fire for a bit, it softens to something like, you know, plasticine sort of consistency. You take the old arrowhead out, you stick the new one in, Bob's your uncle, new end on it. Other uses: the bark is flammable. It's full of lots of oils and tannins and stuff that make it flammable. And the wood itself burns green. There's very few trees in this country where you could cut down a living tree, put it on a fire and it would burn. So that is the bark. And then other uses for it as well: besom brooms, the old kind of handle with a tuft of branches on the end of it. Besom was traditionally made out of birch branches and twigs. So yeah, it's useful for quite a few different reasons. So this tree here is Scots pine. It is the only native pine tree to the UK, although lots of other species from around the world have been planted for plantations for timber. So pine itself, it's a brilliant wood for building because it's light and strong and easy to carve. Unfortunately, other pine species are even better at that, so that's why it's been replaced. Plus other species tend to grow quicker. For food wise, the only thing you can really eat on a pine tree is the pollen in the early spring. So in about April time, it'll produce, well, they look like tufts over the entire tree that stand vertically, and they're called candles because from a distance it literally looks like it's covered in candles. They produce the pollen, which you can use as an additive into flour to make bread slightly more rich in minerals and vitamins. The pine cones themselves, once they're brown, you can actually use them as firelighters because they're very full of waxes and saps that are quite flammable. The tree itself, when damaged, does produce sap as well. So I can pull this out of here. So it produces a sap which can be crushed down quite nicely and turned into firelighters as well. So good for lighting fires, good for furniture, good for buildings, a good tree all around, just not particularly good for wild food. So the next tree we're looking at is goat willow, also known as grey willow. So goat willow has, well, one main use, and that is that the inner bark of the tree itself contains a chemical called salicylic acid. Now salicylic acid, when you purify it down, becomes aspartic acid, and that's where we get aspirin from. Well, we used to, it's produced chemically now. Yeah, so you can chew on the twigs and get pain relieving qualities. Unfortunately, it tastes about as nice as chewing on an aspirin. Same chemical, same flavour, unfortunately, so it tastes absolutely awful. It'll give you stomach ulcers if you use it too often, and it also thins your blood. Now, I've always said that if you were desperate enough to chew on the bark of a willow tree for pain relieving qualities, you're usually in quite a desperate situation. But, like I said, it thins your blood. So if you're lying somewhere with a major broken bone and you can't get anywhere, do you really want to be taking blood thinners? Because you might bleed out. So it's well, you can use it, but there are better ones, and I probably will point one out later on in this video. Better uses of painkillers. So that's goat or grey willow. So this tree, well, shrub, is Gilda Rose. It's one of the commonly planted hedgerow plants in this country. As you can see, it produces little red berries. They are edible, but again, like the rowan, you have to cook them. They used to be called poor man's cranberries because you can make like a cranberry sauce out of them, but you have to add so much sugar to them to make them palatable. You're better off just buying a jar of it from the supermarket. You can see that some of these leaves have holes in them. Look like they're being shot with a shotgun. That's a problem that's arrived in the last 10 years or so. It's called viburnum beetle, because this is a member of the viburnum family. and the grubs eat the leaves, and they can actually defoliate an entire tree, as in take all the leaves off, which obviously, if you do it over a couple of years, will kill the tree. Viburnum beetle came in on the horticulture trade. It came in on garden plants, basically, and then got out into the wild. But Gilda Rose, quite a useful little tree for wildlife, because obviously these berries, the birds love them, even though we have to cook them. So this is alder. This is a broadleaf tree that produces cones, like a conifer, but it's not a conifer. You can see the cones there. Nice and easily identifiable. Found in wet ground across the UK. Has a couple of different uses, neither of them are wild food, but the wood itself is actually resistant to rot while in water. So it's great for things like lock gates on canals, wharfs, piers, that sort of thing. Anything into fresh water, the wood will survive for a long time. And the other thing that happens is when you turn it into charcoal, it grinds up very, very finely. So it's great for making gunpowder out of. So if you go down to the south coast around all the great southern Napoleonic ports like Southampton and Portsmouth and Plymouth, there used to be great stands of this stuff to produce the charcoal to make the gunpowder that powered Nelson's fleets. So useful tree, just not for wild food. So this is rowan, or mountain ash as its other name up in Scotland. As you can see, the berries are quite nice, and you can eat them, just you need to cook them first. If you eat them straight off the tree, you're going to give yourself a very bad belly. You can obviously cook them down and turn them into rowan jelly, very nice. In the spring it has flowers, big flat plaques of whitey cream flowers. Unfortunately they smell terrible. The best comparison I have is catwee. So they may look lovely, but you wouldn't want to take them inside your house. It's a very, very tough tree. It will survive pretty much up to the tops of the Cairngorm Mountains and down, given a bit of shelter. So yeah, it's quite a useful tree for the berries, not only for us but for birds as well. The birds love this tree. You'll quite often find it in car parks of supermarkets. This and its cousin white bean, which produces the same sort of berries but has a bigger leaf. And you will find flocks and flocks of really quite rare species, particularly in the autumn, coming over from Europe using those car parks. There's a species called waxwing. It's pretty much a pink bird. It looks pink. And the only time I've ever seen it is in the Morrison's car park in Middlesbrough, where they've got about 4 or 5 of these. I've spent my entire life in woodlands, everywhere from the Yorkshire Dales northwards, and the only place I've ever seen it is in a Morrison's. But the supermarkets are available, obviously.